You, the VP of Sales for Texas CEO Magazine. I want to welcome everybody here this morning. Thank you so much for joining us. We're very excited to have partnered with Zilker Media to bring you this 4-part event series online, meant to walk you through thought leadership marketing and crafting your brand. Today's particular installment is a deep dive into today's media landscape, a look at mass media versus micromedia. With that, I would like to turn things over to Zilker Media's Chief Strategy Officer, Wes Thang. Wes, welcome. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Whitney. We're super excited to be here, and we've actually got some wonderful guests, panelists who are volunteered to be here. So thank you all for joining. I actually wanted to start, the title of this segment is called A Look at Mass Media versus Micromedia. And those might be terms that not everyone is familiar with. So I wanted to just real briefly define those before we move forward and kind of understand the importance of micromedia. So, 20 years ago, if you wanted to be well known, you had to be on television, you had to be featured in places like the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or a local morning show. And these were outlets that we like to call mass media. They really targeted more of a general mass audience. And as things have developed with smartphones, with social media, with news feeds, people are really much more geared towards very specific at your fingertips type content. And so that's created what we like to call today micromedia outlets. These are smaller outlets compared to your morning show, for example, but they're geared towards very specific niche topics where you can have just 1,000 listeners or followers, but they are much more engaged to the entirety of your content versus only paying attention to 5 minutes of your local news segment. So without further ado, I wanted to introduce you to 3 of our guests who have all started their own form of micromedia in the form of podcasts. And they're here to tell you their own experience of growing their own micromedia, what it has meant to them, their brands, and their businesses. And hopefully it might inspire some of you who are also thinking about starting your own podcast or other forms of micromedia to be able to do the same. So real quickly, want to introduce everyone. Johnny Merritt. So Johnny Merritt is a West Texan native and a partner at Hajar Peters who specializes in complex corporate and real estate legal matters. In addition to having served clients for over 30 years, Johnny is the host of the podcast Shifting the Law, which highlights discussions about innovative attorney-client partnerships and how industry leaders can work towards shifting the legal paradigm. We also have Joseph Obel. Joseph is the founder and host of the Moon Tower Business Podcast. Joseph is also an attorney at Bush, Radnicki, Shelton, and his practice focuses on civil litigation and transactional work. Joseph is also the founder of Vineyard Sun Sunglasses, and he has previously worked in the Texas Governor's Office in the Texas Emerging Technology Fund, and also later served as the general counsel for Vodalize, an Austin-based startup company. Last but not least, we have Erlina Green Hamilton. She is the host of the Dallas Business Podcast, where she interviews Dallas-based creatives, leaders, and entrepreneurs, and occasionally out-of-towners about the work that fuels their lives. She's also authored 2 books, 7 Tips to Breaking into the World of Sports, and The Beginner's Guide to Finding Your Brave. Well, thank you all so much for joining in, and we're excited to have you on the panel today.
Thank you for having us.
Indeed.
Excellent. Well, I wanted to start this by kind of diving in. I think when people think about micromedia and podcasting in particular, it can be very overwhelming. And all 3 of you do this not as your full-time occupation. This is kind of like for a lot of you, started off as just kind of a side hustle or a passion project for you. I'd love to hear from each of you, beginning with Johnny. Why did you start the podcast, and what was kind of the motivation behind it?
Well, thank you, Wes, and thanks for having me. I guess I'm going to start with a shameless plug because it's just the truth. I read Mastering the New Marketing Language by Rusty Shelton, who started Zilker Media. And it talked about different types of use of media and specifically with the result or the end result being podcasting. And frankly, it made sense to me. And I had relocated. I love marketing. Marketing's a part of being an attorney. Frankly, it's very relational, and it's marketing involved. And so I had marketed in a different market before I moved to Austin for 20 years. And when I relocated to Austin, just like you have to do, and as the practice of law develops, you have to, the media and marketing is changing. So after reading Rusty's book, I decided to dive in. And so that's how I got started.
I love it. Joseph, what about you?
So I guess I got started in, I kind of developed a passion for entrepreneurship when I worked at the governor's office in this program called the Texas Emerging Technology Fund. I was able to work closely with startup companies that the state was investing in. I became a board observer in a couple of startup companies in Texas. And I just got to see the ins and outs, the everyday work that entrepreneurs were doing, taking something from a concept to a public company. And so that was just super exciting to me. And once I left the governor's office, I went back into the practice of law, but that kind of fire for entrepreneurship kind of stayed with me. And I was trying to find a way to kind of connect with entrepreneurs, people in the startup community in Austin. And I read business books, I listen to business podcasts, and I realized nobody was really focusing on the full business ecosystem in Austin. And I said, Austin's such a great city. There's so many things going on here, so many great companies that are here and then they're moving here, that I want to try to share the stories of the entrepreneurs, the CEOs, the investors, and the regulators that are involved in business through this podcast. And so I just did it kind of as a side project. I enjoyed it. And it just turned into other things that were great for business that I'm working on. So that's kind of my story, how I got started.
And Erlina, I think you have a very similar story, but in Dallas.
Very similar story. I'll tie it to another story though as well, kind of taking a page from Johnny's book. Really, when the pandemic happened, I love Dallas. I've lived in Dallas, born and raised in Dallas my entire life. My mom was a Dallas police detective, raised triplets, raised all of her kids in Dallas. And when the pandemic happened, prior to the pandemic, we're out, you're moving around, you're at networking events at the Ritz, you're just meeting people. Dallas is moving and shaking. And when the pandemic happened, I just thought Dallas, just became just so quiet, I think is the best word I can use to describe it. And so I was really curious, what were our entrepreneurs? What were our leaders? What were our creatives doing? How were they staying engaged in their businesses? How are they staying engaged with their client base? How are they staying engaged to just get up every day, put on real clothes and get on to doing the work that they love? And so I wanted to really start that conversation and really just opened up my Rolodex, and more people said yes than no. Lots of CEOs, head chefs at restaurants, well-known restaurants. Everyone just said yes, and they were kind enough to come on the show and just tell their truth about what the pandemic and how the pandemic had affected their businesses and their personal lives. But again, like I said, this story is twofold. A couple of years ago, I heard a podcast by a gentleman by the name of Gary Vaynerchuk. And he talked about, what does it mean to rebrand yourself? What does it mean to build a business? What does it mean to give more than you take? And how do you facilitate that? And he talked about podcasting. And if you're in a city that doesn't have a focus on a certain niche, do that, be that, present that. And so that's where the name, the Dallas Business Podcast, came from. I was very shocked that it was not already a thing. And the name was available. But from there, I'm looking at rebranding my career coming out of this pandemic, coming from teaching at the college in Dallas. And so this was just a great fit, a great mode to kind of explore as well.
I love that. And, there's so many things that each one of you, as business owners and even individuals who are listening to this webinar, there's so many things that each and every single one of you could be spending your time on, right? And we are in this world of micromedia where, you can be a part of micromedia as a guest on a podcast, or you could even start your own, right? Which is what these three have done. And so I'd be curious for the three of you, there are so many things that you can be doing from a marketing element, building your personal brand. Why did you pick podcasting? And I'll start with, let's go with Joseph.
I guess, I listened to several different podcasts and I like kind of the format, and, I just thought it would be a good idea to try it. And there are a lot of options when you get started on podcasting, and it can be overwhelming, but generally speaking, it really, you can keep it pretty simple. and it's relatively inexpensive to get started. And so I think kind of those are the factors that played into saying, hey, this is how I can kind of approach what I want to do in that space.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Hurley. Okay, I'll go. It scared me to death. If you got any of you guys are watching this, you notice there's one guy with gray hair, and podcasting was a foreign language to me.
Yeah.
The first time that I knew about it again was reading Rusty's book. And so even after thinking about it and studying it and reading about it and thinking about how wonderful it was, I just didn't think that it's something that somebody in my generation should be doing, and so I have to rely on my daughter for iTunes. And so, but what I'd say to listeners, particularly those that may be my age, if there are any out there, is it's not as difficult as it seems. With just a little help, it comes pretty easy. And I don't know that this answers your question directly, Wes, but one of the greatest benefits that I found from why I love podcasting is, particularly in the practice of law, you don't have time to just sit down and talk. Mm. And what I have found with my guests is I have better conversations with them during the podcast than I have had perhaps in years. And it's just a wonderful way to do that.
Yeah.
I would agree with that. People seem to be kind of open up when you're having a conversation with them on a podcast. You get a lot of valuable conversations through this method.
Yeah. And Johnny, I'll throw you this resource. Your daughter, if you guys aren't using this, Buzzsprout, they upload it to all of the directories. So that may be useful, may or may not.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'll tell you guys, just honesty, curiosity. I think I love the podcasting platform. I love the medium, but I love what us as hosts get to do. We get to explore different areas of thought. We get to explore different modes of doing things. We get to just explore. And so what brought me into podcasting, and I'll just go fully transparent, it's a lot of work, but I think you can find tools like Buzzsprout and platforms to help you get it off the ground. But curiosity, going into a conversation unaware of what someone is going to say, and then letting them just rip, and then you've got so many nuggets there that you can then, as the host, break down and put on different platforms and use that material over and over again. So it just, for again a business case, it just made sense if content is king for you to be able to do something, produce something like a podcast, 30, 45 minutes, and then be able to split it up and use that kind of content into, perpetuity. So I love the medium. I love what I get to do. And I love just the conversation, man. People have stories that they want to share. They have stories that they want to tell, and they're just waiting on someone to say, hey, what's your story? And giving them the room to tell it. So yeah.
Yeah, I equate podcasting as that time period when people are driving to work, where you get to sit basically side by side next to them, and how often do you get to have Brene Brown or Tim Ferriss or whoever your podcaster is right next to you? And for a lot of individuals who are on this panel and listening to the webinar, so much of business is done through relationship building. Right. And podcasting is one of those key elements where people get to hear your voice, they hear your passion, you're interviewing someone who is providing valuable thought leadership. Right. And so for even before a potential client picks up the phone, if they've listened to your podcast, then they're already qualifying you, depending on what you're doing. Right. So I think that podcasting is a great way to be able to translate that, as many of you have mentioned. I'd be curious, and I'll just open this up to whoever on the panel, but how have you seen podcasting benefit your personal brand, your business, what you're looking to do?
Well, I'll just say I'm here on this panel right now. There you go, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so for those of you CEOs, business leaders that are wanting to start a podcast, I mean, as you can tell that, people find you online, they find you on the web, they find you through the Google algorithms, through the internet, and they're able to find what you do. And again, like Wes just said, listening to your show already gives you a little that basis of credibility. And so podcasting is not something to shy away from if you are in interested in having a larger dialogue and already having some foundation, kind of like I'll look at it from the sales point of view, like a warm lead. That's what podcasting really does for you as a business leader. Is it really sets the table for you to already have that introduction set and made. So
it's opened up different opportunities for me as well. One of the guests I had on my podcast, I ended up turning into a business deal that I'm doing with that guest. Also, I get to promote my sunglass business through the podcast. I do some advertising on there. Also, I've been able to get some work from my law firms, some legal work through it.
yeah.
And then the podcast itself has turned into a business. I mean, I have sponsors now, so it's a business in itself. So it does open up a lot of doors.
I just echo exactly what Erlina and Joseph have said. It's just a great way to connect with people, and insofar as the practice of law, having done it for 35 years, I get to tell kind of what I think about the practice of law and how it should be done. The relationship building cannot be matched because you just have such a quality time with people. And another thing that you get to do, and I was complimenting Wes earlier, he starts in a discussion of his biography in Zilker Media, is one of the important things about him as a listener. And we get to listen to our guests and what's important to them, what's important in their business, how they started their business, what's important in leadership, what do they look for in employees, and frankly, getting to hear all that is just a great learning experience. And finally, I'd say that for my podcast, what we do is once it's ready, we then send it to our guests, who then are able to republish it. And I've had lots of guests who just have been so appreciative to have an opportunity to rebroadcast the podcast we've done.
Yeah.
I would also add to that just that I've also been able to connect former guests, like one guest to another, and have them work together and create business for each other. And then it's just kind of rewarding when you hear back from a guest and they say they got business out of someone that heard about them through your podcast. So different things like that.
I think that's exactly right. When you reach out to someone, a lot of the times, if you're reaching out of the blue, their immediate thought is, what is this person trying to sell me? When all of a sudden you're saying, hey, I would love to feature you as a guest. And really learn from you. And then I want to be able to share that episode with you that you can share on social media. That's a value for them. Right. And so Erlina, you had hit on it, where this is content that lives in the web in perpetuity. Right. And so it's always brand building for you. And for those of you who own businesses where one client might be worth 4 or 5, sometimes 6 figures, right? The cost of a podcast and the setup really isn't that expensive compared to what you're getting in return. So I'd actually love to dispel some of that misconception, because I think when people think about podcasts, they might see the Joe Rogan videos where he's got his own studio set up. And thousands of dollars of equipment. Do you mind just sharing a little bit about what your podcast setup actually looks like, and how much you might have spent in just purchasing the equipment?
Yeah. John, are you gonna go?
No, you go ahead, please.
Yeah, no, I'm laughing because that I'm sure people see our podcast and they're probably thinking that there's a whole Joe Rogan type style setup. Right now my computer is sitting on an what is this? An ice, ice holder in a hotel. That's usually how my podcast works. I mean, I spent maybe $45 on a microphone from Amazon. Hosting a website is going to cost you anywhere between $80 to $100, and uploading it to a platform such as Buzzsprout cost me $18 a month. And I do the graphics and I do a little bit of the editing, and then I send it off to have a show mastered, and I pay maybe $25, $35. I was paying $50, but as a business people, we worked those things out and got it down to $25 an episode to have each show mastered. And so it's not a high cost, and I think it's not a high barrier to entry. You just got to have the will to show up every week or show up every other week to get it done. So, yeah.
For me, it's relationships, Wes. I had my wife of 37 years, and I have a young couple that just had a baby. So we just kind of adopted them. They live next to us, and he was an out of work videographer during the pandemic. There just wasn't anything to do. So one night we were talking, and I was telling him how nervous I was about doing a podcast, and he said, "Let me set you up." And so all of a sudden I have this camera that is connected to my desk, my office desk. I've got lighting, and he told me what I needed to do behind me. And so it goes back to a relationship, not expensive at all.
Yeah.
And just a relationship that I had, a guy that was willing to help me.
Yeah, mine is pretty simple setup also. I mean, I think I probably spent $200 total. I got 2 of these Audio-Technica microphones. Let me see. Just like this. I have a couple of Audio-Technica headsets. I use my MacBook Air to do interviews. I've been doing them lately during the pandemic through Zoom. And then when I do in-person interviews, I've done them with GarageBand through Apple. And then that's a free software.
Yep.
And then I just use Anchor to distribute the podcast to all the different platforms. So it's a pretty simple, cheap setup. I did a lot of research beforehand, but I mean, I figured at the end of the day, this is the equipment that could get the job done, and it works.
Yeah. Now, I know, and I would also add to that is it's about finding your light as well. If you're going to do a video component, find your light. That is probably the biggest thing I hear when people. I clip each episode and share it on social media. And
I think we might have just lost Arlena.
You've got to find your light. So learning those different tips and tricks really helps you produce a high quality show with just a few $100. So.
What surprised you most about launching your podcast?
I thought it was going to be, as I started, I thought it was going to be difficult. It wasn't difficult. Second, I thought podcasting was for people that are younger than me. I think I've mentioned that. And then finally, I'm not Oprah and I'm not George Clooney. So why would anybody want to listen to me? Those were my primary misconceptions.
Johnny, you got to give yourself some more credit.
I guess for me, I was surprised how easy it was to get people on the podcast. Getting started, I don't have any background in media or PR or anything like that. And I didn't even know how to approach it, reaching out to people. I was just sending cold emails. And actually, a lot of the way I had success was just reaching people on Twitter, just tweeting at them, and they'd respond and they'd say yes right away. And then I just be honest. Hey man, I'm just getting started with this. This is a brand new podcast, and we'd like to get you on the podcast and share your story. And I was surprised how many yeses I got. Just like Arlena said, and I got quite a few. And then another thing that surprised me was when you look at the metrics of your podcast, you can see kind of the breakdown of the different geographical areas where people are listening, and seeing that there's people from all over the world listening to you. And I'm just focusing on kind of an Austin, Texas podcast in the business world, but there's people from all over Europe and South America and just different all over the parts of the world that somehow see it because you share it on social media, you share it on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. There's people from all over the world that are on those platforms. They can see it, and you never know what that's going to turn into someday, right? So those are the two things that have surprised me about the podcast.
Yeah.
I'll say this to Joseph's point. I think it was Tim. So don't shoot the messenger when I say this, but I think it was either Tim Ferriss or it was Gary Vaynerchuk who said, everyone's a media whore. And so when you go out and you're looking for people to come on your show, he did an episode on podcasting. He said, just ask. Most people say yes because they want the attention.
Right.
But I'll say this, what surprised me most about podcasting, on the flip side of that, just to be fully transparent, I mean, it takes some time when you're looking at editing it. When I first started, I sent it off to be mastered. I found a great guy out of Kansas it's a kind of like the platform Fiverr where you can have anyone do anything for you for $5. But this is another one, Upwork. So those of you who are listening, if you're looking for a production assistant or production person to master your work. Upwork has some great people on it, but I found a guy out of Kansas, and I had him mastering the first few episodes in the first season. And I would get the show back and I would say, I still, there's nuances to a show. There's nuances to a conversation. So I would get the podcast back and I would say, oh man, I still have to go in and I still have to do some editing on my own. And so I'll just tell you what surprised me is how much time it kind of takes to get a conversation condensed, because we know about 30 minutes is the sweet spot. So 45 minutes is a sweet spot for a listener, but also to get the conversation in a flow so that it is what you want to put out onto the airwaves. And so I'd say I just found it very surprising how much time it takes me each week to make sure each episode is to my liking. And I spend probably, if I totaled hours in 1 week, I'd say probably 5 to 6 hours editing, and I break it up in days, and I listen and I cut and I listen again, and I listen again, and I procrastinate. I go chase my son around, but it does take time to get it just the way I like it. If I'm editing down an hour and a half episode, so that's just the truth of the matter that I wanted to put out there. So
I would agree with that. I mean, I feel like you said, I feel like 30 minutes is a sweet spot because people have short attention spans and they don't want to be listening for a very long time.
Yeah.
And it's challenging sometimes. I mean, sometimes you're having a really good conversation. I mean, I've had really good quality conversations that are going on for 2 hours, a little bit over 2 hours. And you can put that out there, but folks are probably not going to listen to the whole thing. So you got to try to pare that down and figure out what's the best content out of those 2 hours. And that can be a challenge sometimes.
Yeah.
One thing I might add, Wes, if you don't mind, for somebody who's out there thinking, is this really worth it? Is it really something I should do? Let me just tell you, about a week ago, I had a really significant client, that a huge real estate guy from the Dallas area, Erlina, and he called and said, I just wrote a book. Can I please be on your podcast? And I thought, wow. So those things start happening, and it is worthwhile, very worthwhile.
And Johnny, you had mentioned this just a couple minutes ago, but again, one of the things that we want to dispel is you don't need to be an Oprah, right? You don't need to be Good Morning America. When it comes to micromedia, it is about running in your lane, and kind of the age-old adage of the riches are in the niches, right? If you have 1,000 followers and 10% of those people convert, and you have $1,000 product, you just built $100,000 business, right? Six-figure business. Right. So for so many people who are thinking in that lane of like, doesn't make sense for me to grow a following, and you really don't need for it to be that big. So I think that's one thing to be able to dispel. I'd be curious for some of kind of your other thoughts around what are some myths around podcasting, or misconceptions that are commonly held around podcasting that you all have witnessed.
I mean, people think it's going to be very time consuming. I mean, it can be, but I mean, if you figure out a method, and I've been able to do this pretty well, it doesn't take a lot of your time if you set things up right. Like for example, I do one podcast a week. I try to get some help through a colleague of mine to do some of the scheduling, and then once we get that booked, I try to spend 15-20 minutes doing some research, and then typically they're all on Zoom, right? So you just hop on Zoom and you have a 30-minute conversation and just kind of let it flow. And then I have a person that does the editing for me, and so they do that for me, and then I post it. So if you do it right, it won't take a lot of your time, and you get a lot done.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose I would say that insofar as a myth, I didn't think anybody would listen, and it's amazing how exponentially it grows. I mean, it maybe nobody listened to the first episode. Frankly, I hope they didn't. But by the time it just exponentially grows and grows and grows, and when I compare that to the old way of marketing, where we'd go to lunch and then hope that we'd get a call from that person we had tagged into lunch, there's just no comparison. I'll echo Joseph a little bit. Erlina, I appreciate your work and reading your about you, your success obviously results from your work ethic and your attention to detail. I appreciate that. I actually hired a third party to help me with editing. And I have a great assistant who helps schedule everything. And so for me, it's really a matter of preparing, 30 minutes before and then turning it over. And although there is a little expense for me, it's nothing compared to the marketing expenses we used to undertake. Fly to Dallas to have a lunch, fly to Houston to have a lunch.
Yeah.
This is, you sit at your office and it's just incredible. So that's what I'd say.
Yeah, and I'd say mainly a main misconception lies within you, the host. I mean, so many, we're not trying to be Joe Rogan's. I'm not trying to be the next Oprah. And so what are kind of some of the stories I think I tell myself when I'm going into a show? And I think if you are a listener first, if you are curious about what the other person is saying, and you're curious about the story that they're going to tell, I think that's where it works out best. And you don't have to be Joe Rogan. I mean, you can just be yourself, and you can shine light on whatever niche you are operating in. And so, as far as misconceptions, I think that was one that I quickly got past, because people, again, were saying yes to the show more than they were saying no. Guests were saying yes, and listeners were saying, we like the show, keep going. That's a big thing. I'll just say for anyone looking to start a podcast is you may not, blow up on the first episode or the first season or even going into the second season. But if you keep going, if you keep trying to find the value, what is the value for the listener, I think you are on a gold mine. And so many people have told me that you've got something here. Keep going. Keep going. So that would be, my advice or on that kind of misconception.
Yeah, I was actually just sharing with Johnny before we hopped on the webinar that I had started a podcast interviewing entrepreneurs who had started $1 million businesses. And I could go to Macomb's business school, get my master's for 60, 80 grand, however much it costs now. Or I could hand select the people that I want to learn from, right? And the podcast allowed me a way to be able to do that. The other thing that I will mention, which I think all of you have done a very good job of, is, there's less of an attachment to the downloads and listenership. It is more so, how do I be a good listener? How do I provide value for the guest, right? And so, you can start a podcast where one of the things that I wanted to learn when I started mine was, how do I get better at asking questions? How do I become a better interviewer, right? That is a skill set that whether you decide to continue with the podcast, whether you decide to dissolve it, it's going to be a secondary skill that's going to benefit you in your job, your career, no matter what you end up doing, right? Yeah. So, kind of thinking through that lanes for people who are thinking about a podcast, are there secondary skills that you might be able to learn and leverage in the future that podcasting is just kind of your outlet to be able to do it? Might be a good way to just kind of test the waters for, if you want to commit to 10, 15 episodes just to see if podcasting is right for you.
Yeah. And Wes, just to follow that, I'll tell you guys, I know you mentioned a couple of times, you said 1,000 fans. And of course, I'm sure you're referencing Kevin Kelly's piece, 100,000 true fans. But also, in saying that, you also learned marketing. We're about to get into sponsorship. What does it mean to have that value added in those KPIs and understand how to build out a sponsorship package that sounds right to the person who is approaching you? And so there are secondary skills that you are picking up when you go into this industry, when you go into starting a podcast. I would say dive in and figure it out along the way.
Yeah, Wes, I would also just kind of mirror what you said. I think that you do develop asking good questions over time. And with the first one, I put together an outline of things that I thought were going to be important. And then some of these are dumb questions. You just kind of got to hone your skills over time and figure out what are things that people want to know about, what are things that people want to hear. And it just takes kind of time to kind of finesse that and get everything right over time.
That's good.
And I've found that really the guests are the one that kind of lead where the conversation go. It reminds me of that quote, and I hope I get this right, that if you talk about other people, you're a gossip. If you talk about yourself, you're a bore. But if you talk about the person you're talking to, you're a great conversationalist. Yeah. And so if you remember that quote, and that's really the mindset you have going into these programs, it's just the podcast will kind of carry itself with the guest going where they want to go.
I would agree with that. I remember the first few, I was pretty nervous. I didn't know how they were going to go. And I just realized that the guests they take the lead and they're the star, right? I try to talk as little as possible. I mean,
Right.
I want to share their story. I want to hear what they have to say, and I want listeners to hear that. And so it's great when they just kind of take the lead and we just kind of go with it.
Yeah. And part of the excitement, I'll share this with you guys and the listeners. Each episode, I try to surprise the guests, because most of my guests have been on other podcasts. And so I try to, the podcast is founded on real conversations with business leaders. So what are the stories that they're not telling on other business type podcasts? And so I always try to dig as much as I can, kind of like the Barbara Walters kind of interview style, where I'm like, I find out the stuff that they're not sharing. I read articles after articles. I really try to bring that to the forefront, because it's amazing when somebody says, "How did you know that about me?" And you're really opening up about a story that really brings the podcast to another level. So, I think that's just probably a pretty cool thing as well to experience.
Yeah, I love that. What would be your recommendation for those who are either just getting started in podcasting or are entertaining the idea of it?
I would say just keep it simple. Do a little research. Get some affordable equipment. I mean, you just need a simple microphone, simple headset, and then just get started. And just record one, get two out there. You can do the first few for free. And I think just getting started and getting it out there and getting a feel for it is the best way to approach it.
Mm.
Yeah. I would say, I was interviewing a marketing strategist 2 weeks ago. And one thing that he told me that I'll never forget, and I'm carrying it with me as I move forward now with going into season 3, is that he said, "Arlene, I can't give you really what I need to give you as far as evaluating the full podcast until you at least hit 60 episodes. And so that number has been in my head, 60 episodes. That's really where we're going to get a real spectrum, a real worldview, a real view of the data. And so I would say, if you all are looking to start a podcast, commit to a number, commit to a schedule, a weekly or bi-weekly schedule, and just do it. But fully commit. And don't leave your listeners or even future guests hanging. So really commit to the process of getting it done and getting it out."
Wes, I'm just going to be bluntly honest. Hire Zilker Media. I mean, that's what I did. And frankly, for somebody who, and Joseph, you kind of do this, we built tenths of an hour. So we're focusing on every 6 minutes. And so for somebody that's in that environment that thinks all I need to do is add something else, there are, and Zilker is who I was lucky to get. There are others out there, but for somebody that's in my position that needs somebody to really take control and help you start it, find that media company, because they know how to do it and they know how to set it up, and they can make it much more efficient for you.
Yeah.
David asked a question. I once heard Evan Smith state that he always goes into an interview knowing only the first and last questions he will ask. What are your comments on that? I think Larry King also does something similar, where he doesn't do a lot of research going into an interview. I'll
tell you my opinion. I do research beforehand, and I always put together an outline, and I never stick to it. I just go in there and it just kind of let it go, and that's the best conversations are just kind of free flowing. In my opinion, I like to have that kind of as a crutch, just in case, I have those questions, but I never end up using them.
Yeah. I like one good surprising question. I like one good, "How did you know this about me? You know me." I like that one good question. And so I do the research. I do, like Joseph, I do an outline. I don't stick pretty much to it as well. But I like having one good solid question that really allows the guests to unwind and really chat. So.
And I'm exactly the same for me. I have an outline, but I just let the conversation goes where it goes, or go where it goes. And I do have one question I always ask at the end, and it just because it relates to my profession. But gosh, who am I to question Evan Smith? Maybe I need to study and I'd be a much better interviewer.
I do always have one final question for guests. And I try to end it on a light note, and I ask, "What's their favorite restaurant in Austin?"
Outstanding.
It's a way to end the conversation, and it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think also for me, one question I'm asking with this pandemic and with the reason why the podcast I started the podcast was how are they processing the pandemic, and that seems to be probably a universal question I've asked in every episode since season one. I'm very curious about how people have are moving through, or have gone through that, gone through this time. So that's probably one consistent question that I'm super curious about, and our guests seem to enjoy answering. So.
I ask a lot too, and it's interesting to see kind of the mix of bag of responses, right? Like a lot of people were harmed by the situation, but some people benefited from it too. And so just to kind of hear the different stories behind that is really interesting.
Yeah.
Excuse me, Wes. I'm sorry. I will say, David, he's doing his homework. That's really impressive that David, either he's doing it or he's done it, but he's studying what is the best way to do it. Frankly, that's good in any profession. So well done. It says David Ask. I'm not sure his last name is not Asks, but David, great question. Great question.
And I think so much of it it boils down to you. And as so many of the guests have mentioned, the first few aren't going to be perfect. Right. So you've got to be able to learn, whether it's asking every single question in your outline, whether it's just having a bumper question at the beginning and the very end. You've got to be able to learn what works with you and what's your personality type. And that's the best way to do it. I know that we are coming up on time, but I want to be able to share with you all and to be able to connect, make sure that people are able to follow you. Where can others learn more about you, your podcast, what you've got going on? I'll start with Johnny.
Shifting the Law is my podcast. You can see my website at Johnny, Johnnny, Merritt, MERRITT.com. And Wes, thank you so much. And Texas CEO Magazine, thank you so much for allowing me to participate in this panel.
Yeah. I would second that as well. Thank you so much, Wes, Zilker Media, Texas CEO Magazine. This has been a lot of fun. You can find the Dallas Business Podcast on iTunes, on Spotify, as Dallas Business Podcast. We have a website, dallasbusinesspod.com, that all of our guests their profiles, their bios are there. And then, of course, we're on social media, on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and LinkedIn. So Dallas Business Pod, or on LinkedIn, we're under my first and last name, Erlina Hamilton, EARLINA Hamilton. So
you can find the Moon Tower Business Podcast on Apple, Spotify. It's just Moon Tower Business. We have a website, moontowerbusinesspodcast.com. We also have a Twitter, Moon Tower Business, Instagram, same, and then a Facebook page as well. And feel free, anybody that wants to reach out with any help, or if you want to be on the podcast, you can reach out to me. My email address is joseph@moontowerbusiness.com. moontowerbusinesspodcast.com, sorry.
Perfect. And we will, I believe we'll send a recap of this webinar for people who weren't able to join. We'll be sure to add contact information just so everyone can connect with you. First of all, I want to thank our panelists for being such wonderful guests on this webinar today. Certainly our partners at Texas CEO Magazine. And then here at Zilker Media, we actually did create a podcasting 101 resource. So if there is, if you're thinking about starting a podcast, you're wanting to enter into the concept of micromedia, starting with your own, we did create this guide specifically for you. And it includes equipment for purchase. Like these guests have mentioned, you can do it for pretty cheaply. There's kind of a checklist for everything that you need podcast related that you can go through. And then we even included templates for email outreach, whether it's, pitching your first guest or follow-up emails once the episode goes live. We wanted to create that resource for you. So if you're interested in that, feel free to email me at wes@Zilker Media. But again, thank you so much for joining today. We loved having you, and certainly we hope you found it beneficial.